and curated by Bill North and Corey Sherman North. Professor Molina has been an absolutely integral part of the Wichita presentation of this exhibition, drawing on her deep knowledge of Mexican history and culture to help WAM curatorial staff with everything from writing labels to tracking down original titles to providing, of course, the Spanish translations. And on a personal note, I must add that Professor Molina was an absolute dream to work with. We called her out of the blue. She was so kind. She was so enthusiastic. She was so knowledgeable. She was so gracious. She was brilliant. I am so pleased that these extraordinary prints brought her into the WAM family. Professor Molina has spent a lifetime between two cultures, but she considers what others might view as a difficulty to be a gift. For Teresa, being linguistically and culturally bilingual has proved to be not only a passion, but also a skill that can be passed to others. She says that to study art, history, literature, and culture in two languages gives one an additional perspective, a way of looking at the world that transcends the artificial boundaries of borders and fences. She has honed her skills with Latin American civilization, Spanish, and education studies at Wichita State University, a master's from Friends University, and translation and interpretation studies in Coyoacán, Mexico through the University of Oregon. A cooperation between WSU and Universidad de las Americas allowed her to study literature in Puebla, Mexico. In 2011, she received a certification to teach English as a second language in order to work with recent immigrants in USD 259. Currently a professor of Spanish, interpretation and translation, Mexican history and culture, and Spanish education at Friends University, Professor Molina leads study abroad groups to Mexico, Cuba, other Latin American countries, and Spain. And in all she does, she is a tireless advocate for Spanish speakers and Spanish culture in Wichita. Teresa, we adore you. Thank you for speaking tonight, and welcome to the program.
That was amazing, and I don't feel like I deserve all of that, but I am so grateful for the call that I got from Tara, because this is something that's been a passion my entire life. I love sharing it, and we are so fortunate here in Wichita to have this exhibition. I don't think an exhibition like this has been seen in Wichita, or many places for that matter, and it is amazing the way it was taken care of and displayed. As I walked through, I kept seeing things that were displayed together, and I thought, wow, how did they know that historically or contextually those things went together so well? And they are amazing in terms of the way they have taken this exhibition and shown it off to good effect. So we have an art museum here in Wichita that is world-class, second to none, and I am so proud of this exhibition in particular, and I'm looking forward to having more exhibitions. And you know, it would be so wonderful to bring our Hispanic friends and their children, because one of the passions that I have is that frequently we have young people who are growing up who don't know about their roots and their history and the glorious history that is theirs. And when they find out, it creates such a sense of pride in them. So I brought my students here several times during the last, since August. And I had one young lady in particular, and I just have to tell you about her. She was walking through, and we were talking about how wonderful the exhibition was and what it represented in the historical context. And she was pretty quiet the whole time, and I thought, I hope she's okay. And then at the end she said, young woman, I have never wanted to tell people that I am from Mexico. I always heard so many things that were negative, and I distanced myself. And it hurt my parents' feelings that I did, but I just was uncomfortable. And now I walk through here and see these things. And then we've talked about so many wonderful things in Mexican history and culture class. And she said, I have completely changed my mind. And as I walk around this gallery, I just think, wow, I'm going to tell everybody where I come from and how proud I am. And that gave back identity to that young lady, which is why I do everything that I do. And I know that I have fellow educators here that I have worked with over the years, from South High, from Newman, from Friends, and my sister cities folks, museum people. I just am so thankful that you're here, and I just want you to help me in this mission of helping young people not lose their heritage. So thank you for being here tonight. That's a big part of that. You are so lovely to come out tonight, and I know everybody is so busy, but this collection is amazing. But as with any collection, it's a lot more interesting, and you are able to appreciate it so much more if you know more about the history and the context that it was in which it was created. And so, and I would not expect everybody to know all of that. I know that most of you know all about the Mexican Revolution and things that happened. And it was a very, very difficult time. And over 1 million people died. And so what we're going to see tonight had a tremendous human cost. And yet, there are things that have been created because of that revolution that generations and generations and generations will look at and be inspired by. And so that's why it's my honor and my privilege to explain a little bit about this. And I think everybody has seen our ad, so we're going to just go right on. Revolution, labor, and life. These are notes from the museum itself, and I was so delighted they got it. I can't tell you the times I've tried to explain about prints like this, about the revolution, about what it gave rise to. And when I read what they had on all the labeling, I just thought, oh, this is so amazing. They understand. But that particular cultural and political upheaval led to art that is so different, such a departure, visually and radically different. And it changed not just Mexico, but the whole world. The whole world had its eyes on Mexico. I think if you have never been introduced to the dictator Porfirio Diaz, it behooves us to take one look. He campaigned as president with the logo that his saying was, only one term, no re-election. And that's when he was going up against his friend Benito Juarez. Well, Benito Juarez gained 3 terms, and Diaz kept trying to take that away from him. And strangely enough, once he did become president, you know how it is about power. It's hard to give up. And power sometimes corrupts, and absolute power can corrupt absolutely. And so, even though he was a hero from the war with France and the Battle of Puebla. And I don't believe that he started out with the idea of being a dictator, but in the end, the Mexico that he created did not value the indigenous and the mestizo people. And because of that, all the heartache that we're going to see took place. So, what does art have to do with that anyway, about a revolution? And when you take a look at Jose Guadalupe Posada, I have been seeing his prints and things about his prints since I was a little girl. I remember when I was a child, my father and I would go to museums in Mexico City, and we would try to see everything. The Museum of Anthropology was the hardest. It took 3 days, and then we had only seen about 1/10 of it, and we had to give up. But for years, I've been looking at these things, and Posada is amazing. He created thousands of illustrations over his career, and the important thing about Posada is the fact that he was such an influence on artists that came after him. Not only was he such an influence on artists that came after him, but he also helped, and he probably would say it's not my fault, but he helped to keep off the revolution. And you say, well, how could an artist do that? Well, what if you have a population that most of the indigenous people never had the opportunity to go to school? And if they did, they didn't have the opportunity to study in their own language. There are 800 language groups in Mexico, but so many of the indigenous people could not read or write at all, and many, and even to this day, many don't speak Spanish. When I go to Yucatan with study abroad groups, I meet many people of the Mayan culture who speak Mayan. There are many dialects of Mayan. My little granddaughter speaks Quechua and Spanish, but there are many dialects of that, and many of those people don't speak Spanish to this day. But what happens with a picture? The people that Posada put his broadsides up for might not have been able to read or write, but they could certainly understand a picture. And so that graphic art became so important to both the social and revolutionary causes that were underway at that point in time. It was the only way for many people to know what was going on and what was happening. So, I think I skipped it. Okay. No. This particular image was taken from last Saturday, right here in Wichita, Kansas. And the little Yaretsi, who's my friend, she is the daughter of Laos Cervantes, and she's little Miss Kansas Latina, and she is just precious. And not only is she beautiful, but she is involved in baile folklorico, which is another form of art which tells our story and our history. And so when you see her, and she is right now honoring her indigenous heritage, but what's beside her is what we call La Calavera Catrina, who was invented by none other than Posada. But to this day, we see her continually. So there's Posada in he had a little workshop, and he was a great observer of what was going on in the political climate of the time. And there were things that he saw that were wrong, and he had a friend who was also a publisher, and they got together, and Arroyo would write, he would draw and illustrate what was going on. And so basically, in this 30-year period, the communal land that the peasants had was sold. Porfirio Diaz allowed a wealthy landowner to purchase as much land as they wanted to purchase. There was no limit. And the thought was that personal ownership of land would create a more efficient use of that land. But basically what happened was that the people that lived on that land and had been producing crops on that land for hundreds of years, their families had been there hundreds of years, suddenly were working for a wealthy hacendado, and generally in conditions that were just almost unsurvivable. So they were working for somebody else's profit, not theirs, on their own ancestral land. And so he began drawing pictures of that sort of thing and letting people know what was going on. And what he did was use broadsides. When I mention broadsides, those are, some of you who are as old as I am, know what newsprint paper is like. It's very thin, and all you have to do is have a print on it and then use a roller with glue, and you can put those anywhere. And these broadsides were all over. In fact, to this day in Mexico, we use that method to get out the word, to have posters, to advertise on almost anything. But he did it on broadsides, which were extremely cheap and easy to reproduce with what he was doing with his grabaciones, his grabados, his prints. one of the things that we think about prints are that even though you can reproduce them and reproduce them and reproduce them, the art that produced those prints is an original work of art. And so, in spite of the fact that you can say, I have a print, it's just a print. Well, it's not just a print. It's a print that was created using original art. So, when it came time for an election, and Porfirio Diaz had been president for 30 plus years now, and he wanted to be president again. So he said, oh, he had an interview with someone from the United States, and he says, oh, I'm going to retire, I'm going to let somebody else take the reins, but he didn't really mean that. And so Francisco Madero was listening, and he said, oh, okay, we're going to have regular elections this time. Well, as it turns out, Porfirio repented of his words, and he decided that he would just arrest Madero on the day of elections. And so, of course, Posada was there to make pictures about that. And what's unusual about this print is that when you look at that caricature of Madero, you would recognize him in any photography. Any picture that you see Madero, you go, wow, I know who that is. So it's one of the things that really let people know what was going on, the fact that he'd been imprisoned. So the whole country found out right away what was going on. Then, I think you'll recognize these characters, Porfirio Diaz and his wife Carmen. Porfirio was mestizo. He was half Zapotec Indian. He had been very, very, very poor as a child. And you know, I always think that would make us more compassionate, having experienced those things as a child. But it doesn't always work that way. And so he, after becoming president, decided that I'm pretty good. And he married first of all, he married his niece. Something that kind of got him in trouble with the church at the time. And they had several children, but after she died, he married Carmen Romero. And Carmen was from a very wealthy family. And Porfirio began to believe that he was one of her elite class. And so he didn't have any compassion for the people that were being oppressed. So here is Carmen, and if you take a look at that hat, and then the other hats that you'll see that she has on, you'll recognize Carmen. Even if it has a skull face, you'll recognize her. And so there's Porfirio, there's Carmen, and there they are in various different functions. And then the caricature that is there is, of course, them as well. And there was never any doubt in anybody's mind who we were talking about, or who we were drawing. So this is something that I'm wondering, I know there are people in this room that know what this is. And it's called the calavera. But a calavera can mean a skull, but a calavera can mean something else as well. And so if you look at that, there's the Catrina, but you see verses below, and it's quite a poem. Well, that poem is also called the calavera, and it's like an epitaph, but it's like a roast. So if you are a well-known political figure or somebody that's well-known in the city, then when they write those poems about you, they roast you. There's usually some barbs in there. And so that's the calavera that he wrote. Las que hoy son empolvadas garbanceras pararán en deformes calaveras. So those who today are all powdered and puffed up and beautifully garbed will one day be deformed skulls. And so that's what he has depicted here. And it is not that we didn't see the imagery of calaveras before. It's not that we didn't have calavera epitaphs that were roasts, but he took this to a form that introduced it to all the people. It became, to this day, people are writing calaveras. And so think for a minute of a friend that has a really good sense of humor. What would you write for their calavera to tease them. You think about that for a minute. Okay, I can say, Matt, he's the one. Now we have him on the run. He was trying to fix my PowerPoint, and that really put his nose out of joint. It really didn't. I'm just giving him a hard time, because I don't think he'll beat me up. But it's something that you really can give somebody a hard time. Usually they're lots of fun, but some of the ones that were about Porfirio Diaz were not particularly appreciated by the presidential office. So that's what a calavera is. It's a skull. It's also an epitaph. It's a roast. So here it says, hay hermosas calaveras de Corsé, alto tacón, grandes calaveras del montón. So they're beautifully garbed ladies with corsets and high heels. But they're going to be skeletons one of these days, just like everybody else. So calaveras de montón, they're going to be in that big bone pile with everybody else. And there's always a little bit of a moral to the story, and that is that death is the great equalizer. So the ladies like Carmen and the other ladies who were, many of them in a group that we call the científicos, about 100 wealthy families in Mexico, wealthy landowners, controlled the country. And the científicos, the ladies, loved, well, they called themselves científicos. Basically, it was because they were some of the few that had an opportunity to get an education. They would go to Europe, they'd go to Oxford, they'd come to Yale and Princeton with their kids to get an education. It was, couldn't do that in Mexico, of course. So, and then they would come back and they would use what they learned to govern the country. And there were some things that they did that were good. They knew that Mexico needed infrastructure. They knew that they needed mines and railways and waterways and that sort of thing. But the way they accomplished it was so detrimental to the country and so detrimental to the indigenous people and the mestizo people. And I'm going to tell you a little more about that soon. But there is that ubiquitous Katrina again. She's everywhere. So to the point that Diego Rivera was so influenced by Jose Guadalupe Posada that if you look, this is an outtake from a very famous work. It is called Sueño de una tarde dominical, The Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Central Park. It's a very Mexican and actually very Hispanic custom for families to go out and go to a park on Sundays. And there always are food vendors and toys and meeting people, and it was a very social activity. There was no Facebook. So they would go out to the parks and promenade. And so, of course, the lovely ladies would promenade in their fancy, huge hats and their French design gowns because they had to come from Paris, or they weren't adequate. And there are ladies there at the marketplace selling food or their wares that can barely put clothing on their body, or food in their mouths, or food in their children's mouths. And as you walk through the galleries, you're going to see Night of the Poor by Diego Rivera. People who sell in the marketplace and they have no place to go, so they sleep right there with their goods and wake up the next day and keep on doing it over and over and over. You'll see one, a little girl with a basket. You can tell she's barely even 2 years old, and she's sitting there with a basket because she's sitting in the marketplace. And that's where she has to live with her mom. You'll see all kinds of people working very difficult jobs. Miners that are searched as soon as they come out of the mine, that are exposed to toxic gases and cave-ins. You'll see pictures all through that gallery. What you won't see are boys in blue velvet suits, girls in pink dresses, or bucolic landscapes, because that radical imagery that I told you about at the beginning,
That's what happened starting with Posada and then influencing the Mexican muralists. So Diego Rivera puts himself as a child, and he's holding La Calavera Catrina's hand. And this other gentleman is Jose Guadalupe Posada. Now by this point in time, he's dead. But Diego Rivera is honoring his contribution, so he puts him in the mural. And there they are, hand in hand with the Catrina. Catrina being, a Catrine is a dandy, somebody who's a foppish dresser, and a Catrina is a lady who does the same thing. So there she is, but you know Diego Rivera. He always has to have some extra little symbolism in there. There's always something that he's enjoying putting in those murals. And so when you look at what's around her neck, now what was very popular at the time was to wear boas. So the ladies went around with the feather boas. But this particular feather boa is very special because this feather boa is a representation of the indigenous god Quetzalcoatl. And when you see the serpent's head, Quetzalcoatl was the plumed serpent, and you see the rattle on one side and you see the head on the other, and it just looks like a feather boa until you look closer. And it's a reminder, you know what, Katrina, you wear the French garb, and you walk around, and you're powdered up and prettied up, but you still have Indian blood. You still are indigenous as well. So that's so indicative to me. Then what you can't see to the side, you see a policeman there to the side, and the people who are by him are indigenous people that were not being allowed into the parks or to the cultural centers, because if it was something special, if it was a holiday, if there were going to be any foreign visitors, if there were many tourists in a place, then the indigenous people were taken out because they were embarrassing. So the policemen would come and take them away or push them away. And we're seeing that happening today, even frequently when we have ambulatory sellers, they are chased away. And the sad thing is, that's how they survive. So that's what's going on in this particular outtake from Dream of a Sunday Afternoon. And then we see something that's, now I have this print from a periodical that came out in the 40s. And it's titled differently. It's titled La Soldadera Maderista, which means that she is a soldier, an Adelita, that fought for Francisco Madero. Remember the guy that got put in prison on the day of elections? Well, he got out of prison, and then he continued to push for election, and people, because they so wanted for Porfirio Diaz to leave power, that they supported Madero. Now, the ironic thing is Madero was a Wesley landowner, but he did have some ideas that were progressive. And so people said, oh, we'll support you. But, so that is why she's a soldadera maderista, and he is a soldier who is a maderista because of Francisco Madero. And when the revolution started, at first, the ladies were saying goodbye to their husbands, knowing that they might never come back. This revolution killed 1 million. Some people say 1 million, some people say 1.5 million. There's some scholars that say 2 million. So their husbands might not come back, and especially in the days when a slight wound could cause an infection, and we did not have good antibiotics available until World War II. So a wound could kill you, even if it was not a severe wound. So they're very sad. The despedida is a sad farewell. But one of the things that started happening is that the ladies started saying, wait, this is my country too. These are my children. This is my land. This is the land where my grandparents and my great-grandparents and my great-great-great, mi tatara-tatarabuela was here, and I need to fight for this too. So, and something that spurred this on, of course, was Jose Guadalupe Posada again. because he began drawing pictures of the Adelitas. The Adelitas are women soldiers. And so here's an Adelita, and one of the things she's writing escaramuza style. Escaramuza style, Mexican ladies who like to do what we would probably consider rodeo, ride side saddle in long skirts. Beautiful outfits, long skirts with their knee hooked over the horn of the saddle. And here comes the Adelita, she's riding side saddle and she's got her pistols and she's ready to fight. So both of those are grabados prints from Jose Guadalupe Posada. And ladies were saying that and going, I'm going to go with my husband. So Grandma, here are her children. Now I'm in trouble. I'm going to stop. If you touch the wrong button. And let's see. Oh my goodness. I'm going to try to go back. But I can't go back until he fixes me here. Thank you, man. Okay, so I'll tell you stories while we the Adelitas were the women soldiers, and they went with their menfolk and you see them with the malas cruzadas, with those cartridge belts. Well, some people like to say, well, they only cleaned and cooked and washed the clothes and took care of the wounded and that sort of thing. But I've seen lots of pictures of these ladies in combat on a horse with a rifle. And a lot of them died. And they were very, very brave. They went with their menfolk, and I don't think that the revolutionaries would have been nearly so successful without that support. And the grandmas and the aunts took care of the children because they knew it was essential. They were not fighting for something that was trivial. They were fighting for their lives, and they were fighting for the inheritance of their children and their heritage. It was worth it. So those are the Adelitas. So you say, why Adelita? There was a very famous woman soldier named Adela, and she was so pretty. She was so beautiful and so smart and so brave. Many of the women turned into colonels in the army because they were so brave. And some of them, there was one they called general, and she actually ordered troops. But Adelita was a famous soldier, and they wrote songs about her. I have that song on there, but it's so hard for us to get the music to come up that I won't try to get that to happen. But it's like, si Adelita fuera de, ¿cómo va? Gracias. So Adelita is such a famous song from the Revolution. There are so many, and what's interesting is that to this day, we still love those songs. And we still hear those songs. I don't know very many places where you sing and hear over and over again songs that are 100 years old. But we do. And one of the things that's really cool is that when you see baile folklorico happening, and the little girl that you saw in the outfit is part of a baile folklorico group here, that is tradition that's over 100 years old. Outfits that are over 100 years old, and they're telling a story, and it's art just in a different form. So, going on, I will try not to push bad buttons. So, this is a miner. And as I was telling you, the miners were very, very badly treated. And one of the things that I talked to you about when the Scientifico is how they were going to develop railroads and mines and waterways and all of that. And I said the way they did it was very damaging to the indigenous people. Well, the reason is that they gave the rights to all of those things to foreign investors. And so various different countries had the rights to everything. The U.S. had railways. British and U.S. had mines. The French were there. And those companies were taking all the profit, and they were paying very little starvation wages to their Mexican laborers. And so this particular miner, you can tell that he's stressed. As they go into the mine, there are toxic gases, there are cave-ins. When they come out, if they come out, they are searched from head to toe in case they found something valuable. And it's completely an undignified search. And so there they go, and then they know if there is a cave-in or something happens or the mine shaft is flooded, whatever happens, there isn't equipment to rescue them. So it's unlikely they'll come out alive. So many Mexican miners were dying, and some of them just from overwork or from breathing in gases or breathing in dust. But you can tell that this is a hard job. Well, what happened in a mine that's from just south of Arizona? The Cananea Consolidated Copper Company had a mine in Cananea. Of course, it was copper. And the owner was William Green. He had all the rights to that mine. And he was paying the American workers good salaries, and he was giving them easy jobs. The Mexican miners were the ones that had to go deep into the mines. And they finally said, we're not being paid, we're dying, somebody has to help us. And they decided to carry out a strike. Well, Mr. Green said to President Diaz, you've got to do something about this right now. Get this strike stopped now. And he said, if you don't, I'm bringing in American soldiers to get it stopped. And Porfirio Diaz said, okay. That was being a traitor to his own country. He allowed foreign soldiers to come on Mexican soil and kill Mexican citizens who had a cause, who had a reason for their discontent. And instead of helping them, he allowed them to be killed. Over 20 miners were killed, some people say more. But the soldiers came and shot into their crowd that was striking. And that happened in 1906. And then, of course, the revolution didn't start till 1910. But people talked about it. Posada drew it. And the whole country knew what happened, that President Diaz had allowed foreign soldiers come on Mexican soil and kill Mexican citizens. This particular picture is Francisco Mora, and he did it in 1946. But all of these things have been inspired by the history surrounding. I talked to you earlier about the científicos, and on that side of the screen, you can see the científicos. They look just like Doña Carmen. They are the garbanceras. We have the word garb in English, which means clothing. The garbanceras are just very elaborate clothing. And so you can see there they are in one of their social gatherings. And they believed that they could completely improve Mexico by bringing in all the foreign investment. And to a certain extent, that's true. To a certain extent. But it's not true that Mexican workers had to be marginalized in order to do that. But one of the reasons that happened is that many of the científicos believed in what they called at the time proto-eugenics. And proto-eugenics is a rationalization for believing that some human beings are less human than you are, or are a subspecies. And some people even thought that there were races that were a different species. It kind of is a leftover from the 1500s and 1600s when the Spanish were debating about whether or not the Indians actually had souls. It's taken a long time, and I'd like to say to you all that today it's different. We know better today, right? Yet do we? I'm just not seeing that. So this is a lesson in point. The people on that side believed that they had every right to do what they wanted to do because they were intellectuals, they were wealthy, and they believed that they knew what was the best for Mexico. The sad thing was it was best only for very, very few. And then here are the indigenous people doing the work that they do, And it's work that, without this work, it's the foundation of the economy. It's how we get our food. It's how we get our clothing. And yet, do they look like they're prospering? So, many people that were working like that became very discontented. They didn't have enough food to give their children. It reminds me of the immigrant workers who are picking crops. Frequently, they don't make enough money to feed their own families, but they're picking food for the nation. That's something that has been going on for a long time. But the indigenous people and the mestizo people in the rural areas, I cannot say that in English, rural, would become discontented. Well, there would be foremen there who would go and drag them out of their house and say, "You're going to work." "I'm sick." "No, you're going to work." And if you didn't want to, you might get a beating. If you did that several times, you might be lynched. As an example, for the rest of the people, you find somebody hanging from a tree. That's something that the rurales, there was a reason for their existence, and that was to eliminate banditry, but they carried it to the extent of we keep everybody in the rural areas under control. And it was pretty effective. So, all of this gave rise to Pancho Villa. And he is kind of he's a hero, and yet he did some really violent things. He's someone who, when he felt vulnerable, could attack viciously. But he and his dorados meaning golden ones, took to their horses, and they controlled the battle for the revolution from the north. They were the División del Norte, and they were excellent horsemen. They were excellent strategists. And Pancho Villa, that was not his real name, took charge of the battle, and he was fighting for Madero at the beginning. And so we see, again, Jose Guadalupe Posada with his grabado, with his print of Pancho Villa. And there we see the real Pancho Villa. And you can see the resemblance. Everybody knew who Pancho Villa was. In fact, what's really unusual is that the U.S. got pretty angry with Pancho Villa because he had been promised arms, and they took his money and they didn't give him the arms, so he raided a town across the border in Mexico. They didn't like that, and so they sent General Pershing to get him, and he had lots of troops. They tromped all around Mexico for months and months and months, about 11 months, and couldn't find him. And they even tortured some people trying to get him to tell him, where is Pancho Villa? And they never could get him because the people were so loyal. But he was a genius. After he died, they took his brain to study his brain because he was so intelligent. And one of the things he wanted people to remember, that he was loyal. He was loyal to his people. And he was one of those people. One of the reasons that Pancho Villa became Pancho Villa, which is not his real name, his name is Doroteo Arango. And Doroteo lived on una hacienda, and the owner's son tried to rape his sister, and so he shot at him. And after that, the hacendado, then he had to flee, and the hacendado was looking for him, and he took to the hills. And there had been a sort of a Robin Hood character that was legendary, and he was Francisco Villa. So every name in Spanish has a nickname, and so if you're Francisco, your nickname is Pancho. And if your name is Jose Luis, it's Huicho. Or if it's Ignacio, it's Nacho, like Nacho Libre. So everybody has a nickname, and so Francisco Villa became Pancho Villa. And he started getting other men who had similar situations who came to him in the hills. Pretty soon he had 600, then he had 1,000, and then he had more. But that División del Norte was a force to be reckoned with. And it was a force to be reckoned with until almost the end of the war, and then something disastrous happened for Pancho Villa. Because World War I, during the time that the revolution was being fought from 1910 to 1920, World War I breaks out. And what happens in warfare in World War I changed the face of battles everywhere. And Victoriano Huerta, who secretly assassinated Madero and took his place, had watched what was going on in Europe. And he started digging trenches and putting barbed wire and got machine guns. And so, of course, Pancho Villa was so successful because they were such great horsemen. But horses and barbed wire don't mix. So up until about the end of the war, Pancho Villa was very, very successful. But probably the man that I truly admire and believe is a real hero is Emiliano Zapata. Emiliano Zapata was from the state of Morelos to the south. The people had been living on that land for so many generations, forever. And then the land was taken away from them and they were creating sugarcane plantations. And the people had to work. And it's very difficult labor, very hot. You have to boil the sugarcane. Many people would get burned. It's very, very difficult to harvest and to process. And so, again, there were the rurales and the foremen there, making sure everybody was working. But because Porfirio Diaz had said, we need more land to give to these wealthy hacendados so they can have private business so that it'll be efficient and make money for the state, he gave to the wealthy landowners the communal land that belonged to the Indian people in Morelos and the south. And so they lost their lands and ended up working for the hacendados for a subsistence living. Emiliano Zapata said no, and he carried ancient deeds clear from the conquest, always in his saddlebags, to remind people that these people have a right to this land. These families, their names are here because they have lived here for 500 years. And you can't take their land away like that. And so he is dressed, and his other soldiers are dressed in what we call manta, tela de manta. And that tela de manta, in a hot climate, is very cooling, and it's loose and loosely weaved, and it's very cooling, and air circulates. And so in a hot climate, and of course a white color, but in that particular situation, Porfirio Diaz was embarrassed because he thought they looked shabby. And he wanted everybody to start wearing trousers like the científicos and dressing nicely. And so he made it illegal to wear those trajes de manta. So when you see this, imagine that those poor people who had nothing else to wear anyway were not supposed to go out and buy trousers and wear those hot trousers to work on a sugarcane plantation. But Emiliano Zapata, incredible, a genius in terms of military, he was so dangerous that the government decided we're going to have to take very strong steps to get rid of him. And so by that point in time, it was Carranza. And they sent somebody who was from the federal troops, and they allowed him to ambush some other federal troops and kill them, and then show Emiliano Zapata that, look, I'm trying to defect, I'm trying to be one of you. Look at all these soldiers, federal soldiers I killed. So come and meet me here at this hacienda. We're going to have a meal, and I'm going to bring my troops to you. And so Emiliano Zapata couldn't imagine that you would kill that many people for a trip. And he rode into that hacienda, at which point he was filled with so many bullet holes that it was really sad for his followers because they were right outside. And I have a documentary that my students in Mexican history see, and some of the men are still crying to this day. The ones that were still alive when the documentary was made were still crying. We should have gone with him. We should never have let him go in by himself. But of course, those men are no longer with us, but the stories still are. And this art is keeping those stories alive. because they have purpose. They have lessons for all of us. So, one of the things I really like that Emiliano is famous for saying is, I want to die as a slave to principles, not to men. Because when they hauled you out of your house and they had whips and sticks and they could lynch you or whatever to make you work, you were a slave, whether you were called a slave or not. So, was it worth it? A lot of times we say, well, we're not sure that 1 million deaths, violent deaths, were worth it. When you think about what happened in the Civil War here in the States and how destructive that was and how difficult it was for our nation to come back together, this is a civil war that went on for 10 years. And it destroyed the economic base. It destroyed people's lives. It displaced so many people. Nobody knew anymore where to go. So, when we look at that, there were some good things that came out of the revolution, although, unfortunately, there were presidents that came after that did not fulfill promises. But one of the things was the 1917 Mexican Constitution, and remember that because you want to see another slide, and it's going to talk more about that Constitution. But basically, land reforms, limited foreign ownership of key resources that included petroleum, water, trains, mines, etc. Workers had the right to create a sindicato, a union, or defend themselves, or to unionize, or to join together to defend themselves. And here's one that was really problematical. Up until this point, almost all education had been taken care of by the church there, and the church owned a lot of property. And when somebody would die, they would pay a 10% on their estate to the church. And then also, the family would be expected to pay for 9 masses, a novena. And those things were so hard on the poor population. When this all comes out, things kind of even out, and it becomes more fair for both people and for the church. But that was quite a problem for quite a while. And then educational reforms, because the government said, hey, we're going to have government schools, free public education for all children. And so teachers went out into the highways and byways, out into the countryside. And not only, here's what I think is amazing. When you look at Mexican history and you get into some of these documents, you will see that the government sent out teachers to teach in the native languages and to create alphabets so they could teach people to read and write in their own language. They also were teaching them Spanish, but they were teaching them both. And that is so amazing to me. That's very forward thinking, in my opinion. So, workers were very important afterwards. And then, Carranza was responsible for the Mexican Constitution, and what's important is restoration of lands to native peoples. They had wanted this for so many years. Benito Juarez had started that with the reform laws, but it never really happened. And then the separation of church and state. We have that here in the United States. It has served us to have separation of church and state. But it's the first time that ever occurred in Mexico. Of course, there were economic and educational reforms. The person that probably did most to put these reforms into place didn't come around until 1934, Cárdenas. He was given the dedazo. The PRIO, the one party that was in power at the time, always would indicate who's coming next. And they would control that person. So it basically would be like Porfirio Diaz having 30 years. It just was different people. It looked like there was somebody different, but basically you got the dedazo because you were going to do what you were told to do as president. And they thought that Lázaro Cárdenas was going to be like that, and lo and behold, he actually decided that some of these reforms needed to happen. And so he gave back a lot of land and carried out a lot of reforms, and also he's the one that nationalized the petroleum, and that's Pemex today. So, all of this created a situation in which Jose Guadalupe Posada starts with his grabados, his prints, but wow, there's some people who are following in his footsteps that are looking at what that accomplished, and the idea is now totally different. Art is not just an aesthetic. Art is a social change agent. Art has not only a purpose of beauty, but also of creating awareness and consciousness in the people who see it. So, and that's something that has always happened in Mexico. When we go to see ruins anywhere in Mexico, you're going to see murals. It's an ancient art form. So, one of the things that was interesting about a lot of the early Mexican muralists, like Diego Rivera, like Siqueiros, like Orozco, they believed in socialism and even communism. Diego Rivera joined the Communist Party. One of the things that's kind of funny that you don't hear very often is that eventually the Communist Party kicked him out because he did too much business with capitalists. but when we look at history, we have to look at it with the eyes of the people that experienced that history. We can't look at history with the labels that mean something to us today and apply that to somebody 100 years ago. So, if you can imagine that Rivera, Orozco, Siqueiros, all of those artists experienced a system of capitalism, but a capitalism that was uncontrolled. There were no protections. And so they didn't have the benefit of history to say, wow, did you see what happened in Russia? Did you see that the communist experiment failed them? They didn't have the benefit of seeing that. They could only see that capitalism had not served their people well, and that they needed something different. And so, when I think about it that way, when I think communist, we go, ooh. But we have to think about them, what had they experienced? In particular, Diego Rivera. His mother was a wealthy landowner's daughter. She was predominantly European, very white. She married Diego's father, who was mestizo. And when they had their first set of babies, they were twins. And there was a twin who was very blonde, and there was a twin who was Diego, who was very dark. Not tremendously dark, but he was dark-haired, dark-eyed, looked like his father. And so the mother was so in love with the little blonde baby. And at age 2, that little blonde brother dies. And the mother cannot be consoled. And so they send Diego, who was also sickly, to live with Antonia, his wet nurse, who knew a lot about herbal medicines. And she kept Diego well, and he spent a lot of time with her in El Campo. And they say that his relationship with his mother was very conflictive. And one of the reasons being that, oh, my beautiful baby died. And he felt like, I'm not valuable. I lived. Can you not be happy that I lived? No, you're a little dark boy. My beautiful blonde baby died. And so you can imagine that having quite an affinity for the indigenous people because he lived among them, and having experienced what it feels like to be discriminated against by your own family, he was in particular rather bitter about that experience. So he went to Europe and he studied all kinds of art forms, Cubism, etc. He admired Picasso, was not well received in Paris, France, but when he came back, he began with inspiration from artists like Posada to develop what was very uniquely his and very uniquely Mexican. And then his fellow artists were doing the same thing. Their art didn't look the same, but it had social ramifications, it had messages, it was significant. So there we see a Mayan mural at Bonampak, and it kind of reminds us of the murals that we see from Siqueiros, from Orozco, from Rivera, and many others. And that is from 600 to 900. CE is a common era, I'm sorry. It's the same thing as AD. So, here we are. We've got something that we have to be so proud of. At the very beginning of our talk, I said, Mexican art changed the world. And it did. It was significant. It was different. It was unique. It was alive. It was colorful. It had life to it. And art changed forever. You don't see princesses. What you see are working people and dignity being given to their lives. So we're going to see what came about with those tres grandes. That radical cultural transformation at the end of 1920, not all the promises of the revolution were fulfilled. To this day, they're not all fulfilled. But it's something that is a work in progress still. So here we have one of the three, Los Tres Grandes, one of the three greats. Of course, Diego Rivera, we talked about him, his childhood. He, in particular, wanted art that promoted socioeconomic equity. He wanted to interact with the environment, business, innovation, and in particular, heritage and destiny. So when you see his art, it's very different from the art that went before. And here's something that I thought was an excellent quote about his art. And again, it refers back to that mural that we saw and a takeout from Drew Beba Sunday afternoon in Alameda Central. Rivera puts in the parts that historians have traditionally edited out. You're going to see the indigenous people. You're going to see the mestizo people. You're going to see the villains and the heroes. And by the way, when you see his murals, you'll know exactly who he thought was a villain and who was a hero. It's pretty obvious. So here we are again. Remember I had talked to you about the police officer keeping the indigenous people and the mestizo people back. They're not supposed to be mixing with some of the society people there. And then, of course, Diego had some issues with the church, so he puts the Inquisition over on the far end there. He has heroes, so there we see heroes from the Mexican Revolution on this side, but we see everybody. And it has a message. We're all Mexicans, we're all here. We need to have Mexican unity, we need to have an identity that is a Mexican identity. And if you can imagine, after the revolution, how hard that was. In the U.S. with the Civil War, how hard was it to come back to having an identity where we're all Americans? When I say Americans, we're all Americans from Canada to the tip of Argentina, but U.S. citizens. We're all part of one great country. But getting to that identity is difficult. So that's one of the things he's trying to show us. Of course, we see the Katrina there. We see Posada. Here's another mural. This one's in the National Palace. I love going to the National Palace. 3 floors of just Aztecs, Mayans, all the way up to the 40s. You see the entire history of Mexico there. No one is left out. And you can see again, do you see the priest in the front? You can tell who he thinks are heroes and who he thinks are villains. He's not ambivalent. We see Miguel Hidalgo, Benito Juárez, Now, Benito Juarez started the laws of reform that started separation of church and state, and also was going to give back native lands to the people who worked it. But he didn't get to fulfill his promise. He had a heart attack during his third presidential term. But he started that. But he was vilified for that. But you see the different, there's Emiliano Zapata. And then Diego Rivera starts going all kinds of places to paint murals because Mexican muralism becomes the rage all over the world. Everybody wants Mexican artists to come and paint and create murals. And because it's just so alive, it's so significant. And so this is what he painted for the Rockefeller Center. Unfortunately, you can see that right under the one propeller, you can see Lenin right under that. And Mr. Rockefeller didn't appreciate that very much. And so he ordered the mural to be destroyed. Fortunately, Diego Rivera had painted a smaller version, which is today in the Palacio de Bellas Artes in La Ciudad de Mexico, in Mexico City. We still have the smaller version. Here we see something that, you remember I talked to you about the fact that schools had been, belonged to the church, predominantly the church ran the schools. And so now we are dignifying the life of laborers, and so that leads us to prosperity for all. So there's food, but there's also a teacher. And in the 1920s, the Ministry of Education had Diego Rivera producing a lot of art that talked to the people about the fact that we have plenty when we work together, we have education, and we value the people that we have not valued historically. So we have education in native languages and reading and writing for all, except that teacher that you see there is a representation of a very brave man, because the Cristero movement attacked the teachers in the rural areas, and they got a nickname from that. They were called Los Desorejados. Desorejados means that this is your oreja. And one of the lightest things that can happen to you is that your ears will be chopped off. So you will be a teacher, but a desorejado. As a teacher, that's a little traumatizing to me to think about. But the ones who were not as fortunate were lynched. They say about 300 that they know of known cases that, in particular in the states that I mentioned there, were either tortured or desordenados or lynched. Then Jose Clemente Orozco. He is considered the most important muralist to work in fresco. He predominantly worked in fresco, although he did prints, all kinds of other mediums as well. But like Rivera, he is not a fan of the church. And when you first look at this, you think, oh, he's helping that poor man. And then when you look at it more closely, it's kind of like he's sucking the life out of that man. And you notice how thin he is, and then you notice the voluminous signs of the priest. And this is what Orozco is trying to say. With separation of church and state, some of these things got better, but at that point in time, there was a lot of criticism of the way that the common people were surviving with the system. So, and Orozco again, highly influenced by Posada, lived just like a couple of blocks away, or just steps away from his studio. I love the shapes that Orozco uses, and certainly with the unemployed, you can see that this is depression time now. Faces of despair, faces of anger, faces of, or bodies of helplessness. You see the manuscript door. So his art is so expressive. You feel what those men are feeling. The art on the other side, look at those shapes. the people that live there blend perfectly with their environment. Their shapes are reminiscent. So he calls it Mexican Pueblo, which is probably an indigenous population based on their dress. Here is one of his murals of Mexican independence from Spain in 1810. It was finished in 1821. The man who began that, Father Hidalgo y Costillas, could not have started that without all the indigenous people that he was a priest to. And you see the figure that is holding out their arms to be delivered from slavery. Wasn't called slavery, but that's what it was. And so then you see Benito Juarez. Right down here is Jose Maria Morelos. And I am so proud of Mexico for something that is very significant. And it's something I don't hear very often. But Jose Maria Morelos was the son of an African slave, an Indian mom, and he also had Spanish. So he was all three. And he was the general that once these Spaniards executed Father Hidalgo, he took over. And he was extremely dangerous because he was a military genius. But he had all of those three influences. Now, today, Mexico has a very small percentage of African descent people, but the reason being that so many of them died in the mines and in the hard labor that at the time that Jose Maria Morelos was fighting the war for independence, there were still a few, but so many of them died. But he was followed along with also Vicente Guerrero, who was also African, Indian, and European. And Vicente Guerrero, his fellow general who helped with the War of Independence, Jose Maria Morelos was finally caught by the Spanish and executed, but Vicente Guerrero finished out the war with the help of Agustin Iturbide. And Iturbide becoming the leader, that's the second president of Mexico was Vicente Guerrero. And you know, Mexico could say, hey, we had a president who was African, Indian, and European way back in the 1800s. And in fact, Mexico abolished slavery in 1821. That was part of what happened with the War of Independence from Spain. Slavery was abolished. Now it took Vicente Guerrero coming as the second president to fully implement that, but we can be very proud that that was part of our history. Siqueiros, he was quite a character. He got himself into trouble all the time by saying things about the government, and ended up going to jail lots of times. And being in jail in Latin America is usually not a very pleasant experience, and if you don't have friends that bring you food and supplies, it's a very rough experience. But Siqueiros always had supporters who would bring him art supplies. So he was one of the three most famous, and you'll see why in just a moment. There he is in jail. He would go in and out. But oil on burlap, I like his materials. That was very innovative. And then look at the shapes of that peasant mother. You can tell that mother loves that child and would give that child anything if she could. But burlap indicates that's a cheap material. That's a rough material. And that's what that mother has. So he painted that in 1929 when they were still working on implementing reforms. And then Siqueiros, of course, he was very into portraying the indigenous people and social realism through his muralistic works. We have this in the galleries. So many of the things that are on these slides, you can see them out here in the galleries. I think that's so exciting. But this is a print, and this is Siqueiros' trio of villains, capitalists, and politicians of the personal game. So What it says there is to keep them out of Mexico, get rid of these folks. So he just wanted greater equality and opportunity for the poor. This is something that he did. He had some really strange dreams in prison, and then he would paint them. So this is like, you can see the gesturing in that work, and it's no details, but you know exactly, you feel that movement. And I think it's amazing. So, and this is where we see that he's starting to relax his techniques. So this happens in 1973. And so he's changing over the years a lot of his style, and he's experimenting more with abstraction. After the revolution, many of you have heard of Rufino Tamayo, very famous artist, and only died in 1991. But look what his subject matter is. It's indigenous people. They were never painted or drawn before. They were not considered interesting. Alfredo Sánchez Torres. That was like quite a job. I think that'd be pretty tough to do. These are the workers, the lumber workers in the Bay of Campeche. It was a very difficult work. Mexican state. Campeche is a Mexican state in the Yucatan Peninsula. That's the traditional method to cut the tropical hardwoods that the U.S. wanted very much. Anquil Bracho. This is about Huichol families, indigenous families, and honoring their traditions and their rights and their ceremonies. And so I think it's very, very interesting. He went back and did research and visited with Huichol people in order to produce this. He did work for the Ministry of Public Education and Cultural Missions to Oaxaca, Nayarit, and other rural sites in the country. Well, this one I am particularly proud of. My students at South High were in a group that we call Latino Leaders at South, and we kept meeting and talking, and they wanted to do something significant. And then we thought about Mexican muralists and how their work always had meaning, always had a message, it had impact. And so Elizabeth Olivera is a young lady that did the initial drawing, and then Armando Mijares, who is a well-known Hispanic artist, came and helped them plot it out on a big wall. And the business donated the wall, and my students painted this mural. I'm so proud of them. But I'll never forget the day that they defaced it for the first time. Somebody painted KKK, go back, wet back, and other lovely sayings all over that mural. But the Wichita artists, the people of goodwill here in Wichita, many of them artists, came with my students and helped them repaint it all. And the sad thing is, they had to do it 3 times. But you know what? That we didn't have at that point in time exactly things that could go viral because social media wasn't quite as developed in 2013 as it is today. But it was the equivalent of viral because it went on the news all over the nation. And the fact that my students, instead of threatening, instead of saying ugly things about the person that did that, kept saying, thank you to the public for helping us put this back. And so they kept getting good press, and finally whoever was doing that got tired of that, defacing the mural. But it's still there today. But it is a tribute to the fact that my students realized, wow, Mexican murals contributed to something so amazing to the world, and we can follow that tradition. We are the sons and daughters of those who created that art. So, Mexican muralism is described as the greatest renaissance in the contemporary world to ever happen. The Mexican muralism art movement was a truly innovative and groundbreaking style of art. So I'd like to play this video because it's a little more information about that, and it's the end. It's also the end of my presentation. So all of you are getting very seat weary. We're at the end. hoping that there were things that were of value to each one of you. You are all significant. There is no one who is not. And we are all human beings, and there is no one who is a subspecies. There is no one who doesn't deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And I love the fact that Wichita Art Museum is putting an exhibition like it has, because they had to go out and ask for that to happen. And I am so proud, because it has that message and it's loud and clear. And they are appealing to families that perhaps never have come to the museum before. I'm very proud of that. So I hope you'll enjoy this video, and then please have some Mexican candy. I had promised on my solemn word that Calavera Catrina will come after you if you open the candy inside the building. But we can let it roll, Senor Matt. Matt was with me at East High years ago.
A Mexican muralist known as Los Tres Grandes. They created monumental visions of struggle, heroic triumph, oppression, and popular power. But there's another side to these artists. An untold story of a cross-cultural exchange that would alter the course of American art. Jose Clemente Orozco, Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, the Mexican muralists known as Los Tres Grandes. They created monumental visions of struggle and heroic triumph, oppression, and popular power. But there's another side to these artists. An untold story of a cross-cultural exchange that would alter the course of American art forever. In the 1920s, a profound change swept across Mexican society. A 10-year civil war had finally drawn to a close. The new government enacted progressive social reforms that empowered workers and farmers, but this transformative project wasn't so simple.
There was no shared culture, no sense of a Mexican national identity.
People were fed up with others telling them what their identity was.
The government turned to the arts. They commissioned grand public murals depicting the history and everyday life of the nation's people. Los Tres Grandes rose to the task.
They were radical, they were revolutionaries of their time, and they showed ideas that hadn't been seen before. These depictions were represented at a monumental size, and so people were able to see themselves represented in these works.
The heart of what we're doing belongs with people, and we want real people to be engaged with real ideas.
Artists including the Mexican painter Frida Kahlo, the Italian photographer Tina Modotti, and the Soviet filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein joined the vibrant avant-garde scene emerging in Mexico. But it was the epic art of the muralists that captured the Americans' imagination.
They never said anything like that. They began to flood U.S. journals about what was called the Mexican Renaissance. So it brought down to Mexico a huge number of American artists.
As political power shifted, mural commissions declined, and Los Tres Grandes looked north to the United States.
The period when the Mexican muralists came to the U.S., when the country was going through the Great Depression.
So the Mexican artists came and they really provided a sense of encouragement to artists that were grappling with the Depression and really provided a vision for an art that would be connected to society and that would have a social role.
Jose Clemente Orozco was the first to come to the United States. His mural for Pomona College in California depicting the mythical Greek titan Prometheus caused a sensation.
The quality of the work and the strength of the expression was something that really hadn't been seen in America.
Someone who really appreciated and thought the world of his work was Jackson Pollock. Pollock went to Pomona College. I call it kind of a pilgrimage to see Orozco's mural.
And Pollock was overwhelmed. He said it was the best painting in the contemporary world. And he kept an image of it in his studio throughout the 1930s.
Jacob Lawrence was also influenced by Orozco, whom he met while working on his migration series. He admired the muralist's commitment to public art that engaged with social and political issues.
When I look at the migration series, it is a call to action. And it asks me to ask myself, what am I creating that is monumental in scope, that has the power to change through time?
Diego Rivera was the second of Los Tres Grandes to arrive in the U.S.
He's considered at that point the hero of the Western world. He embodies the spirit of the Mexican Revolution.
Inspired by his experiences in the U.S., Rivera gave expression to a new vision of modern American industry in a mural at the Detroit Institute of Arts.
His idea about creating a national epic was something that was very influential on American artists.
I think he understood politically the power of representation, that even if it wasn't happening in society actually, that it was an aspirational possibility.
Siqueiros was the last to arrive in the U.S. He was a radical in every way.
What was most important was to produce not only revolutionary art in terms of content, but also in terms of materials. How the material was what contained the revolutionary potential as well, like the techniques and the methods that you employed.
Siqueiros quickly learned that his politics didn't always go over well with his American patrons. His second U.S. commission, Tropical America, overlooked a touristic Olvera Street in downtown Los Angeles.
It wanted something kind of tropical, almost like Brazil, something exotic. And being Siqueiros, he said, I'm not gonna give that to them. So he decided to paint a really shocking image of an indigenous figure being hung as a way of representing the ideals of anti-imperialism.
Shortly after its unveiling, Tropical America was partly whitewashed. 2 years later, it was completely painted over. In 1936, Siqueiros set up his experimental workshop in New York City. Jackson Pollock was one of the attendees.
They would put canvas on the floor and throw paint, splatter it, put things on the canvas. That experience that he had of being free of all conventions really became the hallmark of Pollock's mature style.
By the 1940s, Los Tres Grandes had moved back to Mexico and continued creating their monumental murals and works of art. But the impact continued to reverberate through the work of the many artists whose lives they touched over the years.
This exhibition is really rewriting art history.
It's a testament to a huge amount of bonds that exist between the two countries.
The point of consideration for us as individuals, as artists, as a society, when we enter a show like this, in this political moment, is exactly what we want from art.
Wichita Art Museum, thank you.